Hello folks, and welcome back. My name is Stephanie Canada, and today we're going to roast vintage reproduction patterns. So yes, friends, indeed, my name is Stephanie Canada. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome. Yes, that is my real name. I do everything vintage, sewing, thrifting, and all with heavy doses of sarcasm. Go ahead and click that subscribe button. I would love to have you join me here. Now in today's video, yes indeed, I am going to be roasting reproduction vintage patterns. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to get out of the way first. Number one, I am only here for the big four. Butterick, Simplicity, McCall's, and Vogue. I am not here to rip apart smaller reproduction artists such as Lady Marlowe, Mrs. Depew, Wearing History, etc. Those are all small independent people that take actual vintage patterns and reproduce them for people like you and me. They take lots of time and lots of effort to actually do their best to properly verify that this pattern looks like this pattern. So I'm not here for them. I'm here for the big four. And the second thing to get out of the way, I am not here to rip apart you if you are a person that uses these. If these are the only patterns you have access to, feel comfortable using, whatever your reasoning may be, I'm not here to rip you apart. I'm happy you're sewing, and I want you to continue in your sewing journey. I just want you to be fully prepared that what you're making is not actually a vintage pattern anymore. Well, we'll get to the details of that later. Now I can hear some of you.
But Stephanie, you're a vintage pattern seller. Of course you don't want people buying reproduction patterns. You want them to come buy from you.
Now friends, yes, I do sell vintage sewing patterns. The real ones. But the reason why I'm coming for these people is very specific. And it's not because I think that everyone needs to buy from me, although it would be nice. Because I understand that sometimes you can't find the pattern that you want in the correct size or the lines that you want. Or if you do find all of those magical things together, sometimes they are hella expensive. So I just want y'all to be clear that while I do have a bias toward the original vintage patterns, that doesn't mean that I think that all reproductions are terrible, because the ones made by the smaller independent creators are sometimes quite good. Now, there's always hiccups, but whee! Tangents. That's what I do. Now, while I personally have lots of feelings on this, I know, shocking, right? I did go ahead and do some research as far as what other people had researched along the way. And I did find two specific blogs that I do want to call out because I think they do a really great job of elaborating on how I feel. The first one I want to mention is Andrea Shuey Designs. Shuey? I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. She did a fabulous job of doing a step-by-step, side-by-side comparison of Simplicity 2027 and the Reproduction Simplicity 1590, where she goes in detail with photos and side-by-sides of completed garments to show you exactly how different they are. I adore the work that she did. Please go and check her out because the way she describes everything and the way she shows you side-by-sides is actually my goal in this series. Hopefully, if I have time. And if I can find all the original vintage patterns for not my arm and part of my firstborn. Because believe it or not, friends, in over 6,000 patterns in this house, I didn't have any of the ones that I was looking for the reproductions that I currently own. I don't know how that's possible either. The second blog I want to call out is Carbon Chic by Demi. She also does a really wonderful job of elaborating on all of the reasons why I hate reproduction patterns. We'll save the juiciest ones for later, but that's another one that you should check out because I did reference both of them, as well as going to Facebook. Ah, Facebook, the place where comments come forth from the nether regions, whether you want them or not. And this time, I did. So what I did was I went to two of my favorite groups, which is Vintage Sewing Community and Vintage Sewing Pattern Nerds, to assist with this endeavor and tell me stories about why you too hate reproduction patterns. Now I will be using a few of these examples as we go along today, But just know that you should definitely check those out on Facebook as well. But enough of those shenanigans. Let's grab our coffees and do this thing. So this is going to be a little more stream of conscious as opposed to scripted, so just go with me on this journey, because it might involve a little bit of rambling. Now, the very first reason why I hate reproduction sewing patterns is because people think reproduction equals vintage. No. Just no. A reproduction pattern is exactly that, a reproduction, where sometimes people like to take liberties, where they shouldn't. But let's break it down a little farther. When you get your reproduction sewing pattern, there is no number for the original. Just the reproduction number. Oh god, this is different. Okay, apparently Simplicity reissued the reissue, because that basically so that even if you wanted to go ahead and find the original pattern instead of the reproduction, you have no idea what number it is, because that would be far too helpful. Now, let's say you're in the United States, which I am, and you go to your local craft store, which used to be more plentiful and now have dwindled down to basically just Joann's. And you're looking for a vintage style pattern. Are they more accessible? Yes. But that doesn't mean they actually are vintage. Yeah, they're gonna create cute little tchotchkes, you know, sort of like that right behind me. Or this little button jar, which I made these based off of the cute little kitschy things you see at Joann's. I have a video for it, I'll put it down in the description. P.S. Glue dries out in a hot garage. Hot tip. So they capitalize on the fact that people are looking for vintage patterns or fun things to go along with their vintage patterns. Oh god! My tray's trying to jump ship. Do they get you? Oh, of course they do. They got me! And while they may be more accessible, while you're in store, you might notice a few things. First off, they still come in multi-line patterns, which for folks like me, confuse the living daylights out of me, and I don't find them helpful. I'm a one size, one pattern type of gal. And the second thing you may notice as you're going through the pattern catalogs or the pattern cabinets is that they all look sort of bland and dry and very similar bodice styles and skirt styles. Gee, I wonder why that is. From what we can deduce, it looks like they're taking modern block patterns and then trying to look at the line designs of the original vintage patterns and modify it to modern lines, which is utter bull. So basically what they're doing is dumbing down the pattern so that you, the home sewist, can accomplish it. Which is kind of insulting, because I don't know about you, but if you give me clear instructions, even I can sew the vintage patterns. And y'all, I took a break from sewing for, I don't know, close to 10 years? So to me, dumbing down these patterns is just a real slap in the face to the customer. Your customers are smarter than you think, Simplicity! And the second thing you're going to notice when you go to these books is that, would you like an apron? Or an apron? How about this apron? Or that apron? Or wait, maybe what you want is a poodle skirt. Supplies are limited, only 1,602,000 left. How many times can you reissue a poodle skirt? It's the same freaking thing. Oh, but it's so much better than the last 300 times you've issued it. Come on. There are so many interesting lines for vintage patterns, and yet these companies insist that you either want an apron, a poodle skirt, or an A-line dress. Oh wait, maybe a fit and flare. Oh yeah, don't get me started about the Walkaway dress. We'll get to that later. And now, one of my biggest beefs. They don't draft from original patterns. They draft from line drawings or pattern covers that they see using modern lines. What you're getting is you're not getting a detailed, this line, this dart in the proper vintage style. You're getting what a modern draftsperson looking at a drawing extrapolates from that information, which is through modern lenses, which is not the line that you're going for. I'm not here to harsh on draftsmen. They do as good of a job as they can. I'm not here to harsh on them because they are doing their job as is explained to them by their bosses, whoever. The people I am harshing on is all the executives of the pattern companies. For years, they had all of these patterns. They had them producing them. They had to have had the original blocks or the original designs for these patterns. And yet, they didn't think to keep any kind of archive. Now, I don't know about you, but when you're looking at a history of a company, you really want to see where they started to where they've gone. And these companies aren't small. They have giant warehouses, or at least they used to. Maybe that's part of the problem. But they don't have all of their patterns in backstock that they could just go look at to take and use for future, or, I don't know, hand to a draftsperson to reproduce. Now, am I saying that the executives in the 1930s, 40s, teens, whatever, could have anticipated the grand desire for people to reproduce these patterns line by line? No, I really can't be mad at them for that, because that's sort of hard to see. Because nowadays, there's so many bland patterns that I can't imagine people 50 years from now wanting to make the clothing that is readily available to the ready-made sewer. And maybe that's on me. Maybe in 50 years, 60 years, people will want to make these. But that's assuming that we are still able to live on this planet in 50 to 60 years. But that is a whole other rant. But I am still just sort of shocked that no one had the forethought to say, hey, I should save at least one of these for a general archive. I don't know, I'm a stage manager. Maybe that's just part of my thing. I think to archive everything. Just in case. And now we're to the point where we're gonna dive a little deeper. Because there are some companies, Butterick, Butterick, that are not as great about this. And then there are some companies, like Vogue, that actually took some time and invested some money into reproducing these. And it sort of runs the gamut. So let's start with the better of them. Let's start with Vogue. Vogue, at some point, I don't actually know when the call out happened, but some point during the height of the vintage pattern popularity, they actually put a call out that if you had a vintage Vogue pattern that was really lovely, that you should contact them and they would buy it from you so that they could reproduce it from the original lines. And this is why a lot of the Vogue patterns, as it has been told to me over and over again, are much, much better at adhering to the original lines of the pattern than other companies. Because Vogue took the time and invested real money into reproducing them. And while this is anecdotal evidence, it's anecdotal evidence that I've heard over and over and over again being in this pattern world. So I do start to believe that some of these actually have real coherence, and I'm not giving you the conspiracy thoughts on this. Then you have other companies, like Simplicity and Butterick. I'm not sure about McCall's. Actually, I haven't heard much about the McCall's reproductions. But let's just look at Simplicity for a quick second. Simplicity put a call out for donations. A company that as big as Simplicity didn't bother to invest actual capital into trying to find patterns to reproduce. They opted for donations from fellow sewers because they were gonna donate them back to the people when they were done? Or they were gonna give them the new copies? If that happened, I would be highly surprised. But seriously, a company that large not actually acquiring and investing the capital in finding the best patterns that they had issued and just calling for donations. Maybe that's why we see so many crappy A-lines from you, Simplicity. Now, there is a story about heads in New York of Simplicity going to a plant in Niles, Michigan, and actually saving some of the old patterns that they had found there, which is lovely, and that's great. But the problem is that is a small percentage of the entire catalog that you people had put out. And afterwards, they had apparently invested a little bit of capital by buying selective patterns. But the fact that they didn't do an all-call like Vogue did, where you can get lots of really fantastic patterns offered up to you, and just relied on donations or selective choice, maybe is a reason why their pattern reproductions are not the best. Another reason why these patterns are just a complete and utter mess is because of the instructions. While vintage sewing patterns are a little bit more complicated as far as the instructions go, there's normally an accompanying book to go with it. Whereas modern patterns try and cram all of the pertinent information into no type of sense possible. 'Cause that's helpful. Another person commented on a Facebook group, "The instructions are always a mess. I know that sewing instructions are written for beginner sewists since they assume no one knows how to sew anymore. But there are so many times I will read a pattern's instructions over and over again and have no idea what it's telling me to do. The instructions are horrible. I often needed to read ahead to try to understand. That's why I no longer buy and make modern patterns, only vintage." It's just embarrassing. And at the end of the day, my absolute biggest beef is the fact that people think reproduction equals vintage. Because the fact that they're reproducing these patterns tells modern audiences that they have put in the time and effort to recreate their patterns to a T, which means that people like me that actually sell the real vintage patterns are inferior because we are selling the original ones that are a little bit more fragile or might be missing a piece or two, which is not the case. The people that sell vintage patterns, like me and many in my communities, we thrive on patterns. We love them. We want them to find new homes. I don't want to sit here with 6,000 patterns in my house that I can't use most of them. I want people to have them. I want people to use them. I don't want there to be that barrier to access of them because they think that these crappy things, wherever I threw that thing. Where did I put you? Oh, here. Helpful. Because I don't want people to think that these crappy things, that they actually took time to do them. Because they didn't. At the end of the day, they did not put the effort in, except Vogue, to really recreate these appropriately. And the biggest and most glaring of all of these mistakes is Butterick's Walkaway dress. Y'all, I cannot even describe how terrible that pattern is. How terrible that reproduction pattern is. The original is not so bad. I've had it a few times. It sells quite well because it's a lovely dress. The problem is, Butterick didn't even bother to reproduce this correctly. There are so many sew along with me's, rippings into this thing. And here's the thing, folks. They are all merited. This pattern is garbage. You have to do so much alterations to it. The lines aren't even correct. It's quite honestly the worst of all of them. One person from the Facebook group said, "If you look at the pieces next to the original, you'd never even know you were trying to make the same garment. They are completely different. But the reproduction pattern is to be completely avoided, in my opinion. It is a mess. It's 2020 in pattern form. A dumpster fire." At the end of the day, I really think it's just taking advantage of a consumer that really wants a vintage pattern but is honestly too scared to buy them. And that, I think, is the biggest falsity provided by these companies. Because now they're making patterns that actually are harder than they are for the real vintage patterns. And these sewists, they're getting bogged down and they're having issues with these modern patterns because, oh gee, they're not correct. And then they don't even want to go near a vintage pattern because they think it's going to be worse. When, in actuality, a lot of the times it's easier. I love vintage patterns sometimes for just how simple they really can be. Now, again, I cannot stress enough that when you do a vintage sewing pattern, you do need to have an appropriate time period book to go along with it, because we aren't taught a lot of these techniques in modern day times. However, I really want everyone to have access to these so that they can learn to love them the way that I do. So my advice to you is that if you're looking at a reproduction pattern, I advise instead that you go and find a vintage seller, whether it's me or someone on Etsy or one of your friends, or hey, ask your local church group, does anybody have a vintage sewing pattern that you can try? I think you'll really be surprised with just how easy they can be. Are they still going to be frustrating? Sure. But tell me, raise your hand or hit the like button if you've never been frustrated even sewing a modern garment. Because if you have, I mean, you must be sent from God. Because even sewing vaguely modern things, I am still, there are times I am seriously frustrated. So you just have to take those moments where you do get frustrated with a vintage pattern. Go find a vintage sewing group, because heavens knows there's tons of them, and ask the question. Because I think you'd be surprised how many people in these groups are really willing to step up and help. Just don't be discouraged, and keep trying, because everyone can sew a vintage sewing pattern. I promise. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. The grand total from the giant haul was 607 patterns, which means the winner is Miss Jeanette Hamilton. Please go to www.backroomfinds.com and contact me through my contact page. Thanks for playing, everyone. Click that like button if you've ever been angry at the reproduction pattern companies. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more ranting and sauciness. And turn on the bell for post notifications so that you know every single time that I upload. Now folks, I am going to be dropping down to about one video a week due to some family shenanigans that are occurring. I will be uploading every Friday until at any point I can go back to doing 2 a week. Thanks so much for watching, folks. See y'all next time. Thanks for power washing today, neighbors. I love it. No, what I need is the neighbors to stop power washing their frickin' driveway. And today, I'm gonna rip apart reproduction vintage patterns. Figuratively, not literally. There's no need for that. That's what happens when you go to move the cursor and then you accidentally stop the recording. I don't know where I was. First up, on the very pattern cover, do I have one sitting here? No, of course not. That would be useful. Your customers are smarter than you think, Joannes. Okay, simplicity. Supplies are limited, only 1,427 left. Supplies are limited, only 1,003,027. Supplies are limited, only 1,603 left. Are there McCall's reproductions? I've never seen one. I'm sure there are. Can't imagine they would have missed out on that gravy train. Donations? Oh, I hate my neighbors for power washing today. This is fine. These people, oh God, they stopped. Thank you, Jesus.